The year 1833 rested like a held breath over Jamaica, the island bruised but still burning beneath the embers of December's Great Rebellion, Sam Sharp's words still echoing in the cane fields, British Parliament arguing in faraway London about abolition, while the planters sharpened punishments and doubled patrols to make certain hope did not take root again, and in this fragile in-between lived an enslaved drummer named Cato, born among sugar rows and plantation dust but raised in the pulse of skin-stretched goat hide, where rhythm was the only sanctioned voice he had been granted and yet the most dangerous voice he carried. For every planter feared the drum, feared its memory, feared its secret tongue that traveled across the Atlantic in blood and salt, feared the way a single cadence could summon spirits, send messages through night wind, summon warriors from silence and breath from exhaustion. Cato learned to drum before he learned to cut cane, taught by an elder who whispered that rhythm was not sound but memory, the heartbeat of Africa smuggled into chain, coded and preserved beneath the gaze of masters who preferred hymns to obedience to pulse. And Cato discovered early that a drum could soften labor to something survival, or stiffen a spine into something unbreakable. Plantation overseers allowed drumming only on festival days now, wary because the last rebellion began with hymns and meetings, led not by drums but by scripture, and still they feared sound, feared vibration, feared anything they could not chain. But cane fields did not forget, and neither did men who worked them. And in small stolen moments between sunrise brutality and sunset hunger, Cato tapped rhythms with his fingers on tree trunks, water barrels, his own ribcage, building a language disguised as preparation for harvest festival. But layered beneath cotton and sweat was code. Patterns every elder knew, roots older than every whip, rhythms that once called kingdoms to council along the Ashanti coast before the Middle Passage tore futures into pieces. Each evening, when patrolling militia wagons creaked past barracks searching for forbidden prayer meetings or whispered revolt, Cato sat among his people, appearing only to play for tired bodies. Yet his rhythms shifted, slow and cautious at first, then bolder as weeks passed, and through each beat he carried news. Parliament debating emancipation, missionaries reporting change coming, planters terrified and tightening chains before they cracked, rumors that free villages formed in hills, that Maroons whispered alliances again though treaties cautioned them into uneasy peace. But rebellion did not arrive like thunder. It returned like humidity, creeping into lungs until breathing itself became defiance. Cato watched men and women who once bowed shoulders now hold them straighter, watched prayers grow less pleading, more certain, watched mothers hum liberation into children's hair, and he knew the island stood in a moment between worlds. Freedom promised on paper but not yet willed into life by those who owned land, lives, and law. The overseer on Cato's plantation, a man named Hewitt, sensed change like a dog senses storm, pacing rows with musket and whip, barking orders sharper than before, his nerves thin and eyes restless. For planters feared not only knives or flames but ideas, feared literacy like muskets, rhythm like rebellion, and so Hewitt ordered drums locked away outside festival nights. But sound cannot be locked, and the pulse lived where hands touched earth, where hose struck soil in cadence, where whispered humming filled moonlit cabins like river water in drought. Cato's world moved in cycles of cane planting and cutting, hunger and meager ration, heat and exhaustion, and yet beneath every surface lay motion, men gathering plantain leaves not for food but to signal presence in distant fields, women weaving patterns into head wraps that mapped meetings, old Maroons slipping quietly down from forested hills to trade news of British troops, ships docking at Kingston with officers who spoke of compromise, members of Baptist congregations praying with eyes open, looking not to heaven but horizon, and yet fear hung heavy, not fear of punishment. People had survived that for centuries, but fear of hope. For hope was costly. Hope could be whipped out of bone. Hope could end with men thrown in irons and women left wailing beneath hanging trees. And still it took root, irreversible as tide. Cato himself was not a preacher nor a rebel captain, nor a literate man sending petitions north. He was simply a drummer with calloused palms and a grandmother born in Asante lands who told him once, before the lash silenced her tongue, that rhythm was not music but memory, that each beat was a footstep toward home, even if no ship ever returned. Now with the island vibrating between future and shackle, Cato's drum became his weapon and his prayer, each tone a negotiation with fate, each pause a space where history could breathe. When the plantation announced a festival night to appease the enslaved and display good spirits to nearby planters, Cato felt energy coil beneath his ribs like a storm inside marrow. The master believed music soothed anger, but drumming did not soothe. Drumming summoned, drumming sharpened, drumming remembered, and this night, under torches that flickered against cane fields like restless spirits, Cato sat before his drum and stared at stretched hide, at hardened wood, at the instrument both allowed and feared, given to enslaved bodies like rope to a man invited to hang himself. He lifted his hand slowly, his breath steady like tide, and in the distance maroon horns carried through blue mountain wind, faint but unmistakable. Though nobody flinched or looked, they had learned centuries ago to keep their faces still while spirits roared within them. His first strike was soft, almost hesitant, only a heartbeat, but hearts answered, and as dancers formed circles, as elders swayed, as tired shoulders loosened, rhythm grew, spreading like dusk across sky, layered in codes older than plantation law. To an overseer it was celebration, a harmless indulgence after labor. But to those who listened true, it was signal, map, summons, memory, future. It was drum language that once carried commands across villages before Africa bled into ocean. A call not to arms but to awakening, to readiness, to unity sharpened beneath centuries of lash. The pulse rolled into earth, traveled roots, echoed in distant quarters, and news moved. Soon, soon prepare, watch the moon, watch the signal fire, listen for next beat. Sweat clung to Cato's brow, not from exertion but magnitude, for he understood the line he crossed. Rebellion had failed the year before. Leaders hanged, bodies burned, sermons banned, and yet here he sat, tapping a seam in the world that planters believed stitched shut forever. And he felt ancestors press against his spine like wind against sails. Torches burned lower, dancers grew fiercer. Teeth flashed in moonlight not with mirth but determination. And Cato struck a rhythm forbidden in plantations since first uprising decades prior. The war pattern. Fast, then paused. Then 3 beats like footsteps in cane at night, then silence heavy as prophecy. Hewitt stiffened from his perch, sensing something off but not understanding, and that confusion saved Cato for now. The overseer heard sound, not language, and misread danger as fatigue. Yet Cato saw suspicion rising like tide. As the drum slowed, sweat steaming under humid sky, a quiet passed over the yard, not peace but readiness, the kind that comes when bodies have remembered they are not owned, only caged, and cages crack when enough breath pushes at bars. When Cato lay on his straw mat that night, arms aching, pulse still moving through limbs like river through valley, he thought not of battle but of ancestors sitting along river banks far across ocean, watching him, judging, supporting, and he wondered whether freedom was gift or burden, whether one drumbeat could truly tilt a world built on centuries of shackles. And yet he knew the truth. Sound travels faster than law, memory stronger than fear, and the island already shifted beneath his feet, like earth loosening from roots before hurricane wind. In the still dark, he heard footsteps outside cabins, patrols uneasy, dogs restless and far away. Another drum answered, faint but real, not echo but reply, and Cato closed his eyes, steady breath carrying hope sharper than blade. For rebellion was not noise. Rebellion was rhythm. The days following the festival stretched like wire pulled thin, taut enough that every sound, every murmur in the cane rows felt amplified, as though the island itself listened and watched, waiting to see whether the whisper of rebellion would fade or sharpen. And Cato worked with a stern stillness, swinging his hoe in the humid mornings and cutting cane in the sticky afternoons while his heart beat the memory of that war rhythm against his ribs. Each internal cadence a reminder that sound once released does not return docile. It lives, it spreads, it burrows like seed into soil. It spreads, it burrows like seed into soil. The overseer. Hewitt's gaze grew restless, hardened, as if he sensed change without grasping its shape. And each evening patrols increased, torches bobbing at field edges, dogs sniffing for conspirators who had done nothing more radical than remember their humanity. And yet no one faltered. Eyes met in passing, chins lifted slightly, a subtle language of resistance more dangerous than steel. The island vibrated between dread and anticipation. Market gossip in Spanish Town spoke of laws being drafted in London to abolish slavery. Planters snarled about compensation and property and civilization collapsing. Preachers warned that God punished nations who did not defend the natural order. And enslaved people whispered the opposite, that the world was turning at last, that British ships carried not chains but decrees. Yet paper promises meant little to men who woke each dawn with rope burns on wrist and blood dried beneath shirt, who watched pregnant women stagger under forced labor, who heard iron clang long before freedom ever touched their names. To them, freedom had always been a thing seized first in spirit, then in deed, and only later recognized by law. In the barracks, Cato noticed young boys thumping rough drums on overturned buckets, imitating the war beat without fully understanding its stakes but feeling its urgency and marrow, and elders corrected them in low tones, reminding them rhythm was sacred, not sport, that drumming for rebellion was a vow and vows bled if mishandled. Cato kept his drum hidden during the days, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath his sleeping mat, and at night he practiced silently, fingers tapping air instead of skin, training discipline as much as skill. He knew one careless performance could doom the island's fragile hope. Off plantation, Maroons watched too, ghost-like in forests, neither fully allies nor enemies, bound by old treaties but bound also by blood memory and shared origin, and some slipped down to trade plantains, tobacco, and news. White militias drilling more frequently, British troops uneasy, rumors of emancipation sparking fear among planters who spoke openly of resisting crown authority by force, raising militias to maintain order, which meant maintaining chains. In one quiet evening conversation by a trickling stream, an elder Maroon told Cato that Drums and Hills had answered his call on festival night, that messages now flowed across districts like wind, not planning open war but preparing bodies, sharpening will, aligning breath. Cato returned to the fields with a mind like flint, every blow of his hoe striking earth not as labor but training, each step through cane rows mapping escape routes, ambush paths, hiding spots, though he had no clear plan. Rebellion was not yet strategy, only heartbeat, and he feared the moment emotion outran precision, the moment hope turned recklessly into bloodshed without purpose, and so he watched, listened, waited with the patience born only in centuries of captivity, where time became weapon, where endurance was resistance. But plantation life did not slow for yearning. Punishment still fell, whips still cracked, and one afternoon Cato saw a young girl no older than 10, whipped for dropping a sugar basket, her cries cutting the air like history itself demanding witness, and he felt the familiar burn of rage beneath ribs. Elders held him by silence alone, eyes commanding restraint, reminding him that impulse could slaughter the future they nurtured like secret fire. Yet that night he drummed softly into soil outside his cabin, pressing rhythm into earth rather than air, letting fury become resolve instead of recklessness. Women gathered near, pounding cassava dough in smooth cadence, their movements a counter-rhythm, a grounding one, as if saying, "The body survives so the future can rise. Do not rush death to chase freedom." And nearby, old men sharpened machetes not for cane alone, their quiet scraping a lullaby and a threat. British newspapers smuggled by missionaries spoke of abolition bills debated in Parliament, names of MPs arguing humanity against planters screaming economy and divine right. And though words traveled slowly, each sentence fed hunger like stolen sugar, sweet and dangerous, and enslaved workers debated in hushed tones whether freedom would come by law or by drum, by ink or fire. Cato sat among them sometimes but rarely spoke. He felt himself less leader than vessel, not chosen by title but by duty he had never asked for, yet could not refuse because rhythm called him as surely as wind calls leaves to move. Young men approached him restless, eager, fists ready but minds untrained, and he guided them not with orders but with stories learned from elders who had fought in earlier uprisings, how rebellion must move like tide, timed with moon, how secrecy must weave through kinship not bravado, how fear was not enemy but compass, how drums spoke truth but truth must be carried carefully like flame in dry brush. Meanwhile Hewitt prowled plantation like a trapped animal sensing threat, shouting at work gangs, ordering random searches, beating a man for humming, not realizing that silence could hide more danger than song. And the master, comfortable in great house above fields, drank rum and fretted about property values and wrote furious letters about imperial betrayal, not understanding that his empire had already cracked. The moment enslaved hearts decided freedom was inevitable. One night clouds smothered moon and air hung heavy with coming storm. And Cato sat outside barracks staring at dark horizon, feeling in bones that night itself listened, and a boy approached trembling, breath uneven, saying patrols caught men on another estate plotting revolt, hanged them without trial, and word spread fast. Fear rippled through quarters like shockwave, yet instead of dissolving resolve, it hardened it. Pain had long ago become fuel. That night no drum sounded, not even whispered rhythm. Silence reigned like a vow. A collective breath held, island waiting. When rain finally fell, warm and fierce, it washed dust from leaves, sweat from skin, and Cato lifted his face to sky, feeling storm water like blessing, like baptism before battle, and in thunder's roar he heard ancestors again, not urging violence but urging courage, urging clarity, urging readiness. When dawn came soft and gray, nothing had visibly changed. The field still needed cutting, overseers still barked, dogs still prowled, but beneath routine something new lived. A quiet unity woven through bodies like shared pulse. Women gathered herbs not just for stew but for wounds. Men walked cane rows mapping distances between estates. Carpenters studied beams and nails that might become barricades. Field preachers spoke of Moses not as metaphor but as map. And through it all Cato walked steady, not with pride but with weight. The knowledge that one beat had begun a clock ticking toward a moment none could predict, yet all could feel. As days thickened into weeks, British Parliament neared decision, and rumors said a law would pass declaring slavery ended. But apprenticeship and delay meant freedom not tomorrow but someday too long for men whose backs could not endure another season. Cato understood the paradox. Freedom promised could either calm rebellion or ignite it, depending on whether planters complied or defied, and Jamaican soil had always grown resistance faster than cane when injustice watered it. So he listened to wind across hills, listened to maroon horns, listened to murmurs in barracks, listened to the earth beneath bare feet, waiting for sign not from anger but from alignment. And each night elders prayed without kneeling, eyes open to sky, asking ancestors to choose hour wisely, to spare innocent, to deliver justice without letting grief drown future. And always beneath breath and dream, Cato felt drum waiting, silent but alive, like thunder before strike. Night returned thick and low, settling across the plantations like a veil, and with it arrived a new brittleness in the air, a tension sharp enough that even insects seemed cautious in their hum, as though the trees themselves waited for something to snap. And Cato moved through that humidity with steps careful as prayer, his senses carved sharper with each passing dusk since the festival drumbeat rippled outward. His hands ached constantly, not from cane alone but from holding purpose, keeping fire contained beneath skin, and in daylight he bent beneath overseer commands with practiced obedience, though no part of him bowed. Instead his posture carried a quiet defiance difficult to see unless one knew where to look, a stillness that felt like flint before spark. The enslaved around him felt it too, this strange stirring beneath ribs, this knowledge that history approached not as idea but as wind you could taste, metallic and urgent, like storm before lightning. They chopped cane, stoked boilers in sugar mills, stirred vats where sweet scent hid screams of burned hands. Yet in their eyes lay readiness, and in the cadence of their labor, hoe strikes, machete swings, barrel rolls lived rhythm disguised as routine, timing minds for some future signal. Cato's drum remained hidden, but its echo lived in bodies, in breath, in pauses before dawn when men knelt in fields pretending to tie sandals while whispering routes through gully and riverbank, in women murmuring old Akan words while braiding hair tight for movement, in old men sharpening machetes under moonlight, blades sliding against stone and sound soft enough to be mistaken for cricket song. Meanwhile the white world frayed. Planters in Kingston wrote furious letters threatening to boycott British trade. Militia commanders drilled young men in red coats borrowed from ancestors who fought Maroons decades earlier. Plantation owners rode between estates whispering conspiracy theories about missionary plots and Negro contagion of ambition, and overseers doubled punishments for small infractions, believing fear was fence enough to corral awakening minds. Hewitt, paranoid and loud in his brutality, stalked fields with pistol always visible, beating a man one morning simply for pausing mid-swing, not realizing the man paused because a horn sounded faint miles away, a maroon call sliding on wind like secret scripture, and when lashes fell, those watching did not wince away. They stared, not with resignation but with fury sharpened by restraint, learning the overseer's rhythms, measuring cruelty like soldiers studying enemy pattern. Yet despite growing pressure, rebellion did not erupt suddenly. It simmered because those who planned uprising knew that haste killed movements, that victory required timing like harvest, patience like drought endurance, and the enslaved people of Jamaica were inheritors of centuries of strategy. Maroons had waged war from hills. Nanny herself had used camouflage and spirit lore to outwit British generals, and plantation revolts had erupted before and would again. Cato understood his role not as commander but as pulse. He felt responsibility like gravity tugging his ribs, knowing one beat struck too soon could condemn hundreds, while one beat struck too late could let hope rot. Each evening after labor, when sweat dried salt on backs and wood smoke drifted from cook fires, Cato sat quiet at edge of barracks listening, not to conversation but to the sound beneath it, that subtle tremor in voices when people speak from longing rather than fear, and he marked that tremor growing, night by night. On a gray dawn 1 week after the rainstorm, a missionary arrived escorted by plantation militia, allowed only brief preaching under supervision, and though his sermon spoke of obedience, his eyes betrayed compassion, and when he passed by Cato, slipping him a torn piece of newspaper as if merely brushing sleeve, Cato later hid behind cane rows to unfold it, discovering a fragment from London announcing that the Emancipation Act had passed. It spoke of freedom to begin August next year, apprenticeship before true liberty, compensation to be paid to slave owners, and Cato felt conflicting tides crash. Joy like sun through cloud, rage at delay, suspicion at promises from empire that trafficked in broken ones. But beyond all of that, clarity. The British crown had chosen a side, and planters furious might resist with violence or subterfuge. The news spread quietly across his state, first whispered, then embedded in prayer songs, then carried to other plantations by night travelers whose feet left no trace, and hope surged, cautious but glowing like coal cupped in hands. Yet hope alone did not soften overseers. Rather, it sharpened their cruelty as if freedom itself insulted them, and Hewitt whipped 2 women for laughing by riverbank, declaring mirth a sign of insolence. His rage fueled not by disobedience but by recognition that power slipped from his grasp, grain by grain. That week Cato witnessed elders meet in shadows beneath breadfruit trees, their backs hunched but wills iron. They debated quietly, not whether freedom would come but whether the people should trust planters to honor law or rise early to secure liberation by their own hands. Some argued waiting until August, fearing massacre. Others said freedom delayed was freedom denied, that British promise meant nothing without courage to claim it. And through it all Cato remained silent, listening like drumskin waiting for stick, knowing rhythm did not choose itself. It answered call. One night, as stars glimmered above sugar rows and fireflies blinked like ancestral eyes, a young man named Kojo, eager, full of fight, mourning a brother lost to cane press accident blamed falsely on disobedience, approached Cato trembling with a mix of reverence and recklessness, insisting they strike soon, tonight. The drums call men from barracks now, that overseers fall before sun, and Cato steadied him not with words but with stillness, showing that fury without discipline was blade turned inward. Yet Kojo's desperation was not isolated. Mourning fueled impatience everywhere, and Cato knew if he did nothing, rebellion might burst uncontrolled, drawn not by strategic timing but by grief ungoverned. So he convened with elders, listening as they measured night air, moon phase, patrol routes, harvest schedule, cane dryness that could catch fire like tinder. Rebellion was not mere courage. It was logistics, and plantations trained minds for such thinking unwillingly. Enslaved men timed tasks to survive, timed rests to avoid whip, timed secrets between patrol cycles, and thus they could time war. The decision came not from leader but consensus shaped by centuries of suffering, a date chosen weeks away. Moon nearly full for movement, rumor of militia away training near Spanish Town, cane ripe enough to burn a signal. Until then, silence would reign as shield, obedience as camouflage, and drums would remain still, holding breath. But silence is not peace, and each passing day tested resolve. Hewitt suspected something, though he lacked proof. Sniffing fear like hound, inventing punishments, and one evening he ordered drum confiscated, claiming sound too spirited lately. Cato surrendered instrument calmly, though inside sorrow coiled tight. But the elders had planned for this, and another drum waited buried near riverbank. Hidden like prophecy, nights grew thicker, songs quieter, preparation subtle, bundles stored beneath beds, gourds filled with water, cassava dried for marching. Children told stories of brave ancestors not to entertain, but to plant courage in tender hearts. British ships anchored more frequently at ports, soldiers uneasy, officials speaking vaguely of compliance periods and plantation rights, and planters, snarling about property theft, prepared legally and privately to resist. Some whispering alliances with American slave states to hold system alive, even if Britain withdrew support. In barracks, Cato watched faces, fear flickering, pride rising, love anchoring everything, for rebellion was love too. Love for children unborn, for ancestors betrayed, for dignity stolen. On an evening thick with cicada song, Cato crept to hidden drum, brushed earth from hide, feeling surface like flesh of history, and tapped once, barely audible, yet enough to send shiver through soil. Signal that time neared. Then he walked back, sat among his people, and watched stars wheel overhead like ancestral council deciding fate. And one thought held him steady. Freedom was coming by decree or drum, but either way, heartbeat would lead. The nights in St. Mary Parish lengthened as if time itself were stretching in anticipation, the humid air settling heavy on the skin and clinging like dread, though in Samuel's heart it clung like promise. For each passing dusk carried him closer to a moment he knew might never arrive again. The moment when rhythm would become signal, and suffering would answer itself with flame and force. Through cane rows and coffee fields, whispers traveled unbound, not in reckless shouts but in the steady hum of bodies brushing past one another at dusk prayer gatherings, at Sunday worship, at the washing creek, where women scrubbed clothes and men sharpened tools, disguising steel meant for rebellion as implements meant for work. The plantation owners, grown anxious from rumors leaking from other parishes, watched with thin-eyed suspicion, but even they could not decipher the code of glances, the murmured psalms that bore pieces of double meaning, the subtle shift in posture when drums were tested quietly at dusk in the slave quarters. Samuel's role expanded beyond the boy who once hit a drum in a cane row. He became a quiet pillar, a vessel through which history began to stir itself awake, and the elders who once watched him practice now sought his counsel, not for what he should do, but for when he believed doing must begin, for he alone heard the heartbeat of the rebellion before its first breath was taken. He had become what none of the whites imagined a young enslaved boy could ever be, a strategist hidden in plain sight, a conductor of defiance whose instrument was neither pen nor sword but skin, stretched tight over hollowed Jamaican cedar, a drum speaking in the tongue of ancestors. Yet as the plan took shape, fear was not an intruder but a resident, a weight that pressed into the ribs of every man and woman who walked the fields. Stories of past uprisings lingered in the air like ghosts. The crushed attempt in Westmoreland, the merciless retaliation after the Baptist War in 1831, when leaders were hanged and bodies displayed as warnings. Some who had whispered revolution once again prayed instead for deliverance from heaven, rather than victory on soil, believing that God's justice, though slow, would be cleaner than man's vengeance. Others stood in firm, quiet agreement that liberation through waiting had yielded centuries, and liberation through struggle, bloody though it might become, was the language their people had been forced to learn. Samuel himself lay some nights staring at the thatched roof above him, listening to crickets in the distant lap of water against riverbanks, hearing in them both comfort and threat, and imagining the faces of those he loved turning still in death if the rebellion failed. He imagined his mother's voice, the one memory he guarded like a sacred relic, asking him whether courage was worth a beating heart stilled too soon. But then he imagined her voice again, fiercer, clearer, telling him the living who remain enslaved suffer more than the dead who died fighting. And from that double memory, conviction returned, deeper and sharper. It was not rage that formed the rebellion's backbone, Though rage existed in raw veins among those bruised too often and whipped too cruelly, nor was it blind hope, for no one believed freedom would come without blood or loss. Instead, what bound them was a logic older than the island's sugar mills and older than the British ships that crossed the Atlantic, with chains and names carved into cargo lists. The logic that human life was not made to bow forever, and that a moment always arrives where survival demands risk. Samuel's drum was not a mere object but a testament of identity, carved from wood his forebears once used in West Africa, to summon villages and mark transitions. He would coat its skin in coconut oil and rub it gently, whispering prayers taught to him by elders, prayers that mixed Christian psalms with maroon invocations. For faith in rebellion did not discard the new nor forget the old. It braided them as surely as women braided hair into cornrows to hide seeds meant for planting freedom elsewhere. And each night, as he tapped warm rhythms into the drum surface to test tension and pitch, men would pause their sharpening of machetes and women would hush crying children, their eyes turning toward him because they knew the beat they awaited was not yet the one that would call them to arms. But each practice stroke trained their hearts to beat differently, to hold readiness like coals glowing beneath ashes. Meanwhile, the plantation estate hummed with its usual cruelty disguised as order. Overseers rode horses along cane fields, scanning with rifles slung lazily across shoulders, while the master, older and thick-necked, boasted loudly of his loyalty to the crown and sneered at news of abolitionist petitions reaching London, swearing that Jamaican soil would drown rebels before ever surrendering its sugar to weak sentiment. His arrogance, however, was laced with unease, for he could not forget the smoke that once rose across the island when Christmas rebellion fires lit the sky 2 years prior. He feared the drum. He did not understand it, but he feared it, as all masters did when they heard its beat too close or too confident. Music to him was harmless only when controlled, but Samuel's drumming was never in his presence, and rumors among white households rustled like wind-fed cane. They had seen slaves walking with heads higher than usual, speaking in tones that threaded sorrow with steel, and though none could articulate why, they sensed something invisible sharpening in the night. Still, fear made them crueler, as fear often does. Whippings grew more frequent, not for revolt but for imagined infractions. An untied rope, a slow step, a child crying too loud in the night. Each lash struck flesh, but also struck the powder keg of desperation, smoldering in the hearts of the enslaved. Yet amid the tightening tension, life continued in fragile tenderness. Lovers still whispered dreams by moonlight. Old women still hummed lullabies from homelands they had never seen, but somehow remembered in soul. Children still chased fireflies in pockets of fleeting innocence. Samuel watched them sometimes and wondered if rebellion was betrayal of peace or defense of it. But whenever he saw a child flinch when an overseer's shadow passed, he remembered the answer. Peace under bondage was not peace, only the illusion of it. The elders guided him quietly, not commanding but advising, shaping him not into a martyr but into a leader forged in humility and remembrance. He learned to distribute messages without trace, to mask strategy beneath ordinary labor talk, to time whispers to the rhythm of grinding mills so speech blended with machinery. His drum language evolved from childhood music into coded signal, each pattern tested with utmost secrecy in the dead of night beneath palm trees, where the air smelled of salt and cane and restless ancestors. All things waited, the sugar, the soil, the human heart. As the moon cycles shifted and the wet season crept closer, with lightning storms sometimes flaring over the blue mountains in the distance like warnings from gods or affirmations from the restless dead, Samuel knew the moment was no longer far. He watched young men harden and grow quiet, watched older men hold their chests with trembling hands when they thought no one saw, watched women pack small cloth bundles of herbs, food scraps, flint stones preparing both for battle and escape. Mothers tied children tighter to their backs, and fathers dug shallow hiding pits near tree lines in case the first wave of violence required scattering for survival. In every rustling leaf and every gust of warm wind rolling in from the sea, Samuel felt history vibrating like stretched drumskin, and he understood that rebellion was not merely a choice, it was an inheritance, a torch passed down through centuries of captured breath and smothered fire, now ready to ignite in him and through him. He practiced one final rhythm in solitude, hand steady, sweat beading along his brow despite the coolness of night. The beat soft yet carrying enough force to thrum against his bones. It was the rhythm of uprising, low, urgent pulse like a gathering storm. When he finished, he sat in silence under the sky studded with stars that looked like watchful ancestor eyes. For a brief moment, fear returned. Not fear of death, but fear of failing those who had never been allowed to live fully. But then he remembered what an elder once murmured, that freedom is not measured by outcome but by courage to attempt it. And so, with the ocean distant and the cane fields dark and sleeping, Samuel whispered a vow to the land that had held him captive, but would soon hold his footprints in defiance. The rebellion was not tomorrow. It was not someday. It was coming with the next beat, the next breath. The next night when silence broke and drums spoke louder than chains. The night chosen did not arrive suddenly. It formed like a storm gathering weight over days, each hour tightening the world until the air itself felt strained, as though holding breath for the sound that would fracture silence and reorder fate. On that evening, clouds hid the moon, draping St. Mary Parish in a darkness so complete it felt deliberate, an ancestral cloak thrown across the land to shield the living as they prepared to step beyond fear. The enslaved moved through the quarters with deliberate calm, voices low, eyes bright, not with hope but with resolve, each person aware that they were no longer simply workers in cane fields or shadows in another man's ledger. They had become actors in history's turning wheel, stepping into a moment no one could reverse. Samuel sat alone at first, legs crossed, drum set before him like a heart outside the body, its skin taut, its wood polished as if it were not merely an instrument, but a covenant. He rubbed the surface slowly, the touch both gentle and reverent, for he knew when the first strike landed, sound would cease being music and become declaration. Around him figures gathered one by one, men holding cutlasses disguised beneath cloth, women with herbs tied in satchels and eyes fierce with decisions made long before this night, young boys carrying torches ready to be lit, and elders sitting silent as stone, bearing witness as those who had survived 1,000 indignities and now stood on the edge of a reckoning they prayed to live through long enough to see its meaning manifest. Across the fields, faint lights glimmered in planter houses where white families moved uneasily, sensing something but unable to name it, their unease unspooling into whispered arguments and hurried rifle checks, while overseers made restless rounds on horseback, hooves thudding in the darkness like a warning that came too late. Darkness like a warning that came too late. Samuel lifted his hands but did not strike yet. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened, not to the night but to memory. He heard the moans of shackled bodies on slave ships, though he had never ridden one. He heard the sharp crack of whips hitting flesh in the square where punishments were made public, so lessons could be learned through terror. He heard children crying for mothers sold away, their voices trapped forever inside cane rows like ghosts caught in wind. And beneath it all, he heard drums from far across oceans, drums of Dahomey, drums of Ashanti, drums from Yoruba lands, rhythms carried through bloodlines even after tongues were broken and names ripped away. These were not ghosts. They were convictions, and they steadied him. When his eyes opened, he saw the circle around him had widened, figures stepping out of shadows, breath steady, bodies poised. A soft rustle passed through them. Not a sound of fear but of readiness, and somewhere a baby whimpered before being soothed by a mother, whose arms shook not from fright but from sheer love sharpened into steel. And so, without ceremony yet with gravity deeper than any church rite, Samuel struck the first beat. It was low, like thunder grumbling beneath the earth, and the ground itself seemed to listen. The second beat came faster, the third faster still, until rhythm spilled into night like a heartbeat accelerating toward battle. The sound carried across cane fields, bouncing off hillsides and rolling through gullies, and wherever it reached, enslaved bodies rose, weapons lifted, voices whispered final prayers before turning into movement. Torches flared to life, sparks snapping at the air as fire caught dry brush, the glow faint at first but growing like dawn being forced into existence. Women passed blades to men passed water to children, and elders stood in the doorways of huts murmuring blessings that braided Christ's mercy with ancestral wrath. Samuel's arms moved without pause, muscles burning, sweat running down spine and chest as rhythm poured from him like river current, each strike a command, each vibration a summons. Beneath the drum the soil trembled, not literally, but in sensation, as though the land recognized those born upon it were no longer willing to serve beneath those who claimed to own it. The first attack did not come with screaming, but with precision. Young men crept along the plantation path, torchlight glinting off machete blades, breath held until the moment arrived when steel swung in arcs that were not wild but purposeful, aimed at disabling overseers rather than hacking blindly. The first overseer fell without sound, shock freezing him before pain arrived, and he crumpled into dirt that did not mourn him. The second tried to shout, but his cry became a gurgle, and by the time he collapsed, rebels had already moved on, leaving bodies behind not as trophies but as removed obstacles. Women lit fires in cane fields where the crop, dry from weeks of heat, burst into flame quickly, thick smoke curling skyward in plumes that looked like dark pillars carrying decades of swallowed screams into the heavens. Babies were carried to hiding pits lined with cloth and guarded by elders who whispered old prayers as they listened to distant chaos growing thicker. Dogs barked from planter houses, horses stamped nervously, and lights flickered in windows as white families realized the world they controlled by violence had turned against them, time yielding not to power but to inevitability. Samuel continued to drum, though now his strokes felt less like his own, and more like energy channeled through him from those who had died before seeing such a night. A boy placed water beside him. Another wiped sweat from his brow, their movements reverent as though serving a priest in ritual rather than a fellow enslaved child. The drumbeat shifted, no longer summoning but guiding now, signaling movement to outer fields where rebels expanded like tide rolling across shorelines. Cries began to rise, shouted orders, terrified screams from whites who fled into stables or grabbed rifles with trembling hands, prayers shouted by those who had wielded whip and law and believed God endorsed their dominion. But there was no triumph in the rebellion sound, only necessity. A grim duty carried out by those who knew that mercy for oppressors often meant death for the oppressed. And yet kindness still flickered in some hearts. A nursemaid enslaved within the master's home slipped quietly into the nursery to carry a sleeping white infant to safety in the woods, not out of loyalty but out of refusal to let innocence bear the consequences of systems built by guilt. Humanity in rebellion was not weakness. It was testament to who the enslaved were even after centuries spent trying to strip them of humanity. As flames spread and resistance surged, Samuel felt a tremor in his body, not of fear but of transformation. He realized in that moment rebellion was not merely action, it was awakening. The drum beneath his hands no longer felt like an object but like extension of him, pulsing with life, speaking in a language more ancient than the plantation itself. Fires reflected in his eyes and the night roared, not with chaos but with purpose. But rebellion is rarely linear. Gunshots cracked from a distant ridge, and men who had joined the uprising staggered or fell, bodies hitting ground heavy and final. White militia summoned from neighboring estates rode fast, hooves pounding like counter-rhythm to the drumbeat's call. And still Samuel played, knowing that victory was not measured in whether they lived to see sunrise but in whether the world remembered they had chosen to stand rather than kneel. The cost would be severe. That truth sat heavy on every throat. But cost did not diminish righteousness. It confirmed it. Somewhere above the ridge a woman screamed, a raw, shattering cry that sliced through night and blood, a reminder that rebellion is born not from desire to kill, but from wounds that never healed. The sky above flickered from firelight reflecting off low clouds, giving the illusion of dawn before dawn came. And in that strange half-light, Samuel sensed the fragile line between triumph and tragedy tightening. Yet he did not falter. His arms ached, fingers stung, palms throbbed, and still he played because if he stopped, silence might smother resolve. Fear might reclaim even the bravest hearts. As long as rhythm moved, rebellion breathed. And so he struck, each beat a vow, each vibration a legacy, each sound a hammer hitting the coffin of servitude. The night was no longer just night, it was judgment, it was testimony. It was memory being written not with ink but with courage and blood and unbroken will. And though Samuel could not know what dawn would bring, he knew one truth with clarity sharper than steel. The enslaved had stood, had risen, had answered history's call, and nothing, not death, not suppression, not empire, could undo the fact that they had dared to claim themselves human in a world built on denying it. The first hours after the uprising began did not feel like triumph. They felt like something heavier, a reckoning settling onto bones and earth alike as night twisted forward and time blurred into a single long breath of fire, steel, and beating hearts. The rebellion spread in waves, some strong and organized, others scattered as fear collided with courage and across the parish. Enslaved men and women who had waited lifetimes for a moment of power suddenly felt the twin weight of possibility and danger pressing against their ribs. Samuel kept drumming, but now his rhythm changed. The call had been given, and now the drum became anchor, steadying spirits as chaos began to widen. The cane fields burned like a living sea of flame, smoke rising in towers that reached toward the heavens as if demanding judgment, and sparks drifted like fireflies twisted into vengeance. Voices rose from every direction, war cries, prayers shouted into wind, the crack of gunfire from panicked whites firing blindly into night shadows, the guttural thud of machetes striking wood and flesh, the hiss of burning sugar as it dripped molten and dangerous. It was not glorious, it was raw, terrifying, vivid, real. Freedom did not arrive dressed in victory. It arrived carrying blood and tears, and every rebel felt the weight of that truth even as they pressed themselves into action. Samuel's hands trembled with exhaustion, but he did not stop. Even when sweat stung his eyes, even when the drum vibrated against sore palms, even when his arms felt carved from stone and pain ran up to his shoulders, he continued because the beat was no longer for calling, it was for holding. At his feet the dirt churned where men had paced, where women had knelt to tie cloth around wounds or cradle children too young to understand why their mothers' voices shook with ferocity and fear. The air grew thick with smoke and heat, the sky above glowing an unnatural orange that blurred into dawn prematurely. But dawn was still hours away. What glowed was rebellion burning itself visible. A man stumbled into the clearing where Samuel played, his arm bandaged in torn muslin, face streaked with ash and blood. He whispered news between gasps. The first wave had succeeded, but militia patrols were gathering near the river crossings. Riders had been seen signaling toward coastal barracks. Once the alarm reached the town, soldiers would move. The men who listened did not flinch, but their eyes tightened, jaws clenching as the enormity of the moment deepened. They were not naive. They had always known retaliation would come like floodwater, merciless and fast. But knowing did not make facing it easier. It simply steeled resolve. Women moved quietly around Samuel now, tending to the injured, helping hide the vulnerable deeper in the woods where roots and shadows formed natural shelters. A grandmother pressed a damp cloth to a boy's forehead and hummed an old maroon lullaby. Her voice cracked but steady, a melody that carried memory older than the plantation system itself. Near her a young woman tore strips from her own skirt to bandage a man's leg. Hands swift, movements practiced from years tending wounds the overseers inflicted. There was no panic, only urgency. Slavery had trained them all in endurance and silent efficiency and survival under pressure. Freedom work, it seemed, used those skills differently but demanded them just as fiercely. Fires crackled in the distance. The land groaned beneath change, and Samuel felt the weight of ancestors pressing upon him, not as burden, but as presence, as though thousands knelt around him unseen, lending strength through every beat. He did not know if the rebellion would survive the night, but he knew this: silence had been broken forever. Even if they died, something else, something indestructible, had been born. But rebellion is not only flame and force, it is also doubt rising like tide. As the first adrenaline faded in some hearts, fear returned like a familiar ghost. Some whispered whether they should flee to the hills before militia came. Others argued they must press advantage before the whites organized fully. A few, remembering massacres after earlier uprisings, urged mothers and elders to head toward maroon territory in the Blue Mountains while fighters stayed behind. Samuel heard fragments of these debates between beats, the rhythm of human conflict interwoven with the rhythm of his drum. He had no authority beyond sound, yet in that moment the drum felt like command, not of obedience but of unity. He struck harder, slower, deeper, steady pulses like footsteps climbing, like heartbeat refusing to give way. The voices quieted. They listened, not to him but to something older, something that whispered through wood and hide and sweat, "Do not fracture. Do not scatter yet. Stand together while strength still breathes," and so they did. Groups reorganized, weapons redistributed, fires monitored to ensure they spread toward plantation storehouses, but away from the hiding children. Scouts ran barefoot into darkness, returning with intelligence. A house abandoned, a path blocked, mounted whites gathering near the road leading to town. Every detail mattered. Every footstep was strategy. Every heartbeat a countdown to confrontation. Samuel stopped drumming only long enough to drink, hands shaking as he lifted a gourd to his lips. The water tasted of smoke and ash, as though the rebellion had seeped into every element, but it steadied him. He blinked, chest rising in heavy breaths, and when he resumed playing, the beat was quieter. Not because courage faltered, but because the rhythm now guided and shaped movement, rather than igniting it. The flame had been lit. Now the embers needed shepherding. Rebellion was not just fire. It was discipline, timing, grit, grace. Near dawn, the horizon began to pale, a thin gray-blue seam appearing at the edge of the sea, and with it came a moment of suspended breath. The night had been theirs. The coming daylight belonged to no one yet. Not the enslaved, not the enslavers, only to uncertainty. Light would reveal bodies, would trace paths of destruction, would show rebels where defenses held and where they cracked. Samuel slowed his drumming further, listening to the hush that settled across the clearing as if the world itself were leaning in. In the distance, roosters crowed, ordinary sound in an extraordinary morning. The rebels paused, not from regret, not from surrender, but from awareness that dawn would test resolve like night never could. The fire glow faded into ember-red streaks as smoke drifted thick through humid air, and some men bowed heads, whispering prayers not for victory, but for strength to endure whatever came next. Women tightened cloth around their waists and picked up tools not only as weapons, but as symbols of labor they had chosen to reclaim on their terms. Children slept, unaware of history forming over them like shield and storm. Samuel's arms slowed until the drum fell silent. Not a collapse, but a pause, a rest before the next beat demanded itself. The quiet after hours of rhythm felt strange, almost unnerving, like breath held too long. He placed both hands flat on the drum, feeling its warmth, feeling the tremor in his own body. He did not know if they had won anything tangible yet. Perhaps they never would, but he did know this. They had stood when standing was death. They had refused when refusal was forbidden. They had spoken through fire and rhythm that their lives were not disposable, not property, not silent. The night had changed them, carved them into something history had not prepared for but could no longer deny. Whether they lived another hour or another lifetime, the world would not return to its previous shape. He lifted his gaze to the horizon as the first fragile beam of sunlight touched the smoke-filled sky, painting the world in ash gold. The land looked wounded and alive all at once. And in that moment before day truly broke, Samuel felt both small and immeasurable. He was one boy, one drum, one heartbeat among hundreds, yet he had become vessel for voices buried for centuries. Freedom might not arrive today, it might not arrive tomorrow, but it had been claimed in spirit, and once claimed it could not be unclaimed. His fingers twitched, ready to strike again when needed. For now the drum waited. The rebels waited. The island held its breath. Dawn was not peace, dawn was judgment, and they would meet it standing. The sun did not rise gently over St. Mary Parish that morning. It clawed its way through smoke and ash as if forcing itself upon a world that had changed without its consent. Pale light cutting jaggedly through scorched cane stalks and twisting branches as though illuminating a battlefield, rather than a plantation. The first rays touched the bodies of rebels and overseers alike, lying amid charred ground and torn earth. Life and death mingled in a quiet too heavy to be peace, too taut to be surrender. The smell of burned sugar and gunpowder hung thick in the air like a shroud, sweetness turned rancid by violence, history breathing through wounded soil and hot wind. Samuel sat near the drum, his back straight despite exhaustion settling in his bones like lead, his fingers stiff and rough with dried sweat and the residue of night-long fury. Around him, survivors whispered low, not in panic but in solemn calculation, voices steady even as eyes glistened with grief for those who had not lived to see the dawn. The rebellion had not collapsed, but nor had it succeeded in sweeping power from the slaveholders in one night. Instead, it had carved a wound into the island's soul that could never again be covered by plantation pomp or colonial arrogance. A wound that bled truth. From distant hills came the faint echo of horns, militia signals, sharp and urgent, cutting through the morning like hawks seeking prey. Riders were coming. Retaliation, hungry and predictable as the tide, would fall upon them soon, and every rebel knew it even before dust clouds appeared on the road. But where fear might once have bent spines, now resolve held them upright. They had crossed the threshold from silence to voice, and there was no path backward, only forward, even if forward meant sacrifice. Women moved with purpose, tending to the injured with soft hands and fierce eyes, whispering courage into ears that trembled not with regret, but with the shock of being alive when death had marched so close. A young mother tied a strip of cloth around her child's wrist, not as ornament but as talisman, her fingers steady despite the bruise swelling on her cheek from a blow taken in the night. Elders murmured prayers that sounded like mourning and prophecy intertwined, their voices weaving through air thick with grief and grit, and children still half asleep clung to their skirts, sensing danger without understanding its scale. Men sharpened machete blades dulled by struggle, wiped blood from their hands without ceremony, their movements mechanical, instinctual, as though ritual itself had replaced thought. They prepared not because they believed they would win, but because dignity demanded resistance even when hope trembled. Samuel's drum was silent beside him, skin taut and marked with the imprints of fists that had spoken life and death hours before. He touched its surface once, a feather-light graze, feeling it still warm from exertion, its silence now louder than any beat. The drum had summoned rebellion. Now in its quiet, it held vigil. When the first horses appeared on the ridge, white militia uniforms stark against smoke-stained horizon, the rebels did not scatter. Instead, a hush settled so profound it seemed the island itself paused, breath caught between cycle and consequence. The riders paused too, struck by the sight of enslaved people standing, not cowering, not begging, but formed in lines like soldiers shaped by suffering rather than training. Guns glinted in militia hands, machetes glinted in rebel hands, and for one suspended heartbeat the world balanced itself on blade-edge possibility. One move, one spark, and the island would bleed anew. Samuel rose, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a slow inevitability, legs trembling yet firm beneath him. He looked young then, just a boy, thin and weary, ash-streaked and barefoot. But there was something in his posture that unsettled even those armed and mounted men on the hill. Something ancient, something that belonged not to the plantation world, but to the lineage it tried to erase. He lifted the drum, not to strike but to carry. He placed it beneath his arm, grounding himself in its weight like a warrior taking up shield, and began walking forward with steps neither rushed nor hesitant, his face unflinching as the militia raised rifles instinctively but did not fire. He stopped halfway between both worlds, between enslaved and free, between life and death, between rebellion and whatever future lay shivering behind dawn's fragile light. His voice when it came was soft, barely above breath, yet those closest heard, and the quiet traveled outward like ripples across still water. We did not kneel. Militia rifles tightened, fingers twitched along triggers, horses shifted nervously. But something in the morning air held fire back, not mercy, not hesitation, but recognition that the old order, though not toppled, had been fatally pierced. One rider called out, voice cracking with the strain of authority confronted by undeniable humanity, demanding surrender. No one moved. Surrender was a language the enslaved had spoken for generations under duress. Now it had been stripped from them. The rider's voice rose again, louder, angrier, but still rebels stood. Not as fools courting bullets, but as people who understood that obedience had never spared them, and silence had never protected them. It was not death they defied, it was erasure. Even if bodies fell, identity would not. The second call brought mounted troops clicking weapons, and Samuel's heart thudded, not with fear but with weight of legacy, the knowledge that stepping back would mean handing back everything born in night's fire. Yet before rifles cracked, an elder woman walked forward, her back bent, her face lined with decades of toil and heartbreak, her hands calloused from cane and childbearing and burying too many to name. She raised her chin with fragile defiance, her presence not challenge but truth. "You cannot kill us into silence again." Her stance broke something in the air. For a moment the militia wavered, seeing not threat but testimony, and that moment, small as breath, was victory in itself, proof that power trembled when confronted by unbroken will. Then reality closed like fist and orders snapped from a mounted officer, and the clearing braced, not for defeat but for consequence. The first shot did not go toward Samuel. It went skyward, warning, command, a violent punctuation demanding dispersal, and slowly, deliberately, rebels stepped backward, not fleeing, not collapsing but withdrawing like tide, collecting children, supporting wounded, retreating into cane shadows and woodland hollows where resistance could live beyond open confrontation. They did not turn backs in fear. They stepped away so they could rise again. Samuel followed last, drum still under his arm, eyes locked with militia leaders a moment too long, long enough to be remembered, long enough to be hunted later, long enough to brand himself in memory of empire as the boy who beat freedom into being. As he disappeared into trees, gunfire erupted, not toward rebels now out of sight but into air and earth, a futile attempt by power to reclaim voice. But gunfire cannot erase rebellion once spoken. It only records its fear. Deep in the thickets, rebels gathered, breath ragged, hearts hammered with exhaustion and stubborn fire. Some wept quietly, for the dead, for the living, for the future uncertain and heavy with threat. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at hands that had held weapons and drummed war into night, realizing they had touched history and been reshaped by it. Samuel set the drum down gently in the dirt, hands trembling, body finally remembering it was young and tired and mortal. Tears came hot, silent, not of regret but of release. Beside him, an old man placed a hand on his shoulder, not in comfort but in acknowledgement. The rebellion might be crushed by force. Some here would be captured, punished, perhaps killed. The militia would hunt, and the planters would rage, and the colonial courts would demand vengeance. But even as the future's teeth sharpened, something irreversible had happened. The enslaved had risen. They had chosen themselves. They had breathed free air, even if briefly, and that breath would echo far beyond cane fields and militia lines. Rebellion was not a moment, it was a seed. This night, this dawn, this drumbeat would carry forward in memory and whisper across generations until the day slavery itself collapsed beneath weight of its own wrongness. Samuel lifted the drum one last time, pressed his forehead gently against its skin and closed his eyes, feeling a pulse that belonged not to him but to all those who had lived and died in bondage. The rhythm was not gone, it had simply moved inside. Around him, rebels prepared to scatter into hills, to join Maroons, to hide among sympathetic freed people, to survive however they could until another moment, another call, another reckoning. Samuel stood, weary but unbroken, and walked into the dense green where history waited to follow him. The cane field smoldered behind him. Empire trembled ahead of him, and the world, though unchanged in law, had shifted irrevocably in spirit. Chains had not vanished, but they no longer defined the heart. And as morning wind rustled leaves above, it sounded almost like a drumbeat carried by nature itself, soft yet certain, a reminder that freedom, once awakened, does not sleep again, does not sleep again.